Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is going to be the making of this little number. So this is a quick, easy, straightforward little make. I've kept the finishes super simple. So if you're interested in seeing how I sewed it up, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is what's described as a luxury satin. Satin on one side, matte on the other. It's got a good bit of weight to it, but a beautiful drape also, so good for a project like this. And on to the cutting out. This is my front. I have one layer of fabric underneath this pattern piece and a few notches. So I have one at the center of the neck and one to indicate the underarm point on both sides. And then here I'm just marking the pleat legs. And then to mark the bottom of the pleat, popping in a pin. And now to mark with my chalk pen where that pin pierces the fabric. So just doing that on the wrong side of the fabric. Removing my pins, and this is what I've got. So now to pin up those pleats. So going in through one dot, out through the other, and pinning in place. And then making sure those notches are lined up at the top, popping in another pin. And I'll do exactly the same to the other two pleats. And this is how it looks. And ready to stitch. So starting at that little chalk mark, back stitching and sewing straight up to my notches at the top. Back stitching to finish. So that's my first one done. And I'll do exactly the same thing to the other two pleats. So that's the second one done. And now for the last one, exactly the same thing again. Starting at the dot, sewing straight up to the notch, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's all three complete. So I'll just give those a good press. And now to hold those pleats in this position, I just want to run a stitch line right across the top of the shoulder. So back stitching to start, using a little bit of a longer stitch length. Stitching here within my seam allowance and back stitching to finish. So as I say, that will just hold everything nicely in place. So now that my pleats are all secure, I'm ready to add my little button loops. So to make the loops, I've cut myself a strip of the outer fabric on the bias. It's about 1 inch wide, and I'm just folding it in half along its length and pinning, creating a nice crease line along that center. And I'm going to stitch just a couple of millimeters away from that crease line. Back stitching to start, using a tiny little stitch length here. Back stitching to finish. And instead of cutting my threads here, I'm going to give myself a little length of thread, which I'll use in a second. So now I just need to trim down that seam allowance. That will just make it much easier to pull the whole thing through and keep it nice and neat and tidy. So I'm taking off probably about 2/3 of that seam allowance. Now that that's done, I'm ready to pull the whole thing through. So to do that, I'm just going to tie that little length of thread I gave myself to the end of a darning needle, and then popping my needle into the center of the fabric and pulling that fabric through to the right side. And once it's all done, this is how it looks. So just trimming off the ends, so happy with that. And now for my button loops, I need 4 strips of this fabric. So just measuring here, 2 inches long. So that's that done. And off camera, I just run one little stitch to hold those two ends together. I just find it much easier to do this by hand before applying them to the garment. Just lining up my loops with the shoulder seam and pinning and ready to stitch. Stitching here within my seam allowance, backstitching to start and backstitching to finish. So that's my loops all tacked into place. And now that that's done, I'm ready to add my facing. So I have one layer of fabric underneath this pattern piece, a little notch just to indicate the center. So now I'm going to add a little bit of lightweight interfacing here. This is the press-on kind, and I'm adding this just to give myself a little bit of crispness around the neckline. So that's how that looks. And now that that's done, I just need to clean up that bottom edge. So off camera, I've just ran that edge through the overlocker, and this is how it looks. And now that that's done, I'm ready to add this piece. So laying it right sides together with my bodice and pinning around the neck and over the shoulder. Backstitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. Taking it nice and easy here, trying to make sure that I'm lined up right along that edge. Little pivot there at the shoulder. And finishing with a backstitch. So that's how that looks. So I just need to trim down that seam allowance, and this time I'm using pinking shears. So just like my little length of loop before, I'm taking off probably about 2/3 of that seam allowance here. And now I just want to press that facing away from the bodice, but make sure that that trimmed seam allowance in underneath is butted up against the facing. And I'll finish that off camera and ready to understitch. So I'm stitching here directly through the facing and through that trimmed seam allowance in underneath. I'm only about 1 millimeter or 2 away from that seam that you've just seen me sew, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, backstitching to start and backstitching to finish. So that's the neckline understitched. So now I need to do exactly the same thing just across that little shoulder piece. Backstitching to start and backstitching to finish. So that's how that looks. And once it's had a nice press, this is how it looks from the inside and from the out. Nice and neat and tidy. So I'm going to set this piece aside for a second to work on the back. So my fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a little notch to indicate the underarm point and the center of the neck. So that's that done. So before I can join this piece to the front, I just need to finish off the neck. And I've decided to use a bias finish here. So I've just cut myself a strip of bias. It's about 1 inch wide, and I'm lining that up with the neckline, right sides together, and stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, backstitching to start and backstitching to finish. So that's how that looks. So just like before, I need to trim down that seam allowance. So again, taking off about 2/3 here, and in preparation for understitching, I'm pressing that bias away from the bodice, making sure that trim seam allowance in underneath is butted up against the bias and ready to understitch. So just doing exactly the same thing here as I did on the facing on the front. Backstitching to start, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, and backstitching to finish. So that's that done. So I just need to finish off the edge of the bias. So I'm just tucking it in underneath. Giving it a nice press. pinning into place and ready to stitch. So stitching this time right along that inner crease edge, using that same longer stitch length, taking it nice and easy here, trying to stick as close as I can get to that crease edge, and back stitching to finish. So that's that done. And after a nice press, this is how it looks. So now before I can join this piece to the front, I just need to finish off those shoulder seams on the overlocker. And just to give a tiny little bit of structure to my button placement, I've added a little bit of interfacing there. I've added the same finish to the front shoulder seams. And here, just lining up my front over my back, right sides together, lining up those shoulder seams and pinning, and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance and back stitching to finish. So that's the first shoulder seam done. And for the second, I'm starting at the edge of the shoulder, back stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance until I get to about 1 centimeter or so inside the facing. Back stitching. So that's the second shoulder done. And after a good press, this is how they look. So happy with that. And now just to finish off that facing edge, I'm folding it back on that shoulder just at the seam allowance, and I'm just going to stitch the seam allowance to the facing. That's just going to give a nice neat finish around the neck. So that's how that looks. So happy with that. So now that my neckline is all finished and my shoulder seams are all done, I'm ready to add my buttons. So just lining up my little loops with my back shoulder, pinning. So I'm just using self-covered buttons here. I have 4 of them and I've just stitched those on off camera. And this is how they look. So I am super happy with how this has turned out. So now that that's done, I'm ready to finish my armholes. So for this little top, I've decided on a double folded hem. So I'm just pressing that raw edge in underneath by about half of my seam allowance, folding again by the same amount and pressing. Pinning into place, and I'll finish that off camera. So this is how that looks, and ready to stitch. So stitching here using that little bit of a longer stitch length again, back stitching to start, trying to stick along that inner crease edge the whole way along, and back stitching to finish. So that's how that looks. So it just needs a little bit of a press off camera, and this is how it looks. So happy with that. So now that that's done, I'm ready to close up my side seams. And just like the shoulder seams before, I've ran those through the overlocker just to neaten up the edges. So laying one over the other, right sides together and pinning. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance from the underarm point right down to the hem. Back stitching to start and to finish. So that's that done. So it just needs a nice press off camera, and this is how it looks. And while I was at the pressing table, I've just prepped my hem. So just like the armholes before, I've decided on a double folded hem. So I've just pressed and pinned that into place, and here just stitching along that inner crease edge. Using that same longer stitch length. Back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. So that's that done. And after it's had a nice press, this is how it looks. And with that, this little top is complete. So I have my armholes all nicely finished with that double folded hem. I've got my buttons and loops in at the shoulder, got those gorgeous pleats along one side, the neckline all nicely finished with the bias at the back and the facing at the front. And this is how it looks on. So I'm super happy with how this has turned out. I love the fit, it's so comfortable. I love all of the detail around the shoulder, the loops, the buttons, the pleats. I think this is a perfect little top that can be dressed up or down depending on the fabric. Love how this turned out.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you guys in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye, folks!